All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to VSPG. Today we're hearing from Professor John Tarduno from the University of Rochester. His talk is titled Earth's Magnetic Field and its Relationship to the Origin of Life, Evolution, and Planetary Habitability. So I'll introduce Professor John Tarduno for us, and we'll get going. So Professor Tarduno's research centers on detecting the past geomagnetic field to learn about the evolution of Earth's surface and deep interior. His recent research includes studies of the very origin of the geodynamo and the mechanism within Earth's core that generates the field. In his publications, Professor Tarduno asserts that the geomagnetic field is essential for the development and sustainability of a habitable planet. Professor Tarduno received his PhD in geophysics from Stanford University in 1987. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford and ETH Zurich before joining Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where he was an assistant research geophysicist. He joined the University of Rochester in 1993 and founded the Rochester Paleomagnetism Laboratory. Professor Tarduno served as chair of Earth and Environmental Sciences for 12 years, and since 2019, he's served as the Dean for Research. Professor Tarduno has sailed on ocean drilling cruises and was lead proponent and co-chief scientist on ODP Leg 197, Motion of the Hawaiian Hotspots, a paleomagnetic test. He has conducted field work with students in India, Lesotho, Swaziland, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Brazil, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, and has led 2 expeditions into the Sahara and 10 to the high Canadian Arctic. Professor Tarduno is a Guggenheim, AGU, and AAAS Fellow and has received awards at the University of Rochester for distinguished undergraduate teaching. Professor Tarduno was awarded the Price Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society for his achievements in detecting the absolute motion of hotspots, overturning the notion that they are fixed points over which the tectonic plates move, opening the way to new insights into mantle convection. He received the EGU Petrus Peregrinus Medal for his seminal studies on the evolution of the early Earth's magnetic field. So thanks, Professor John Tarduno, for being here with us today. Please go ahead and take it away for us.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll start with some motivation and try to give you the flavor of the things that we work on. And really, what we're trying to do is look at the Earth's magnetic field back in time to study this relationship. It's really about solar terrestrial interactions and their relationship to the magnetic field. And that can be summarized by something we call the standoff distance. So this is really a simple pressure balance. The actual relationship is more complicated than this, but it's a convenient way of summarizing this through time. Now, the standoff distance is really just this balance between, on the numerator, the Earth's magnetic field. I'll be talking almost entirely about that. And the denominator is the pressure from the solar wind. What's on left is actually not a test for your eyes, but those are actually stars from a NASA photo. And how do we know about the pressure of the solar wind? We know about those from astronomical measurements of stars that are similar to the sun but have different ages. So from that data, we can then have curves of the pressure of the solar wind through time. And we showed how you might do this in a review paper now about 15 years ago in PEPI. But if anyone is interested in that part of the story, you can take a look at that. Now, those really haven't changed very much, except for the very earliest Earth. And we can talk about that if there are any questions later. So the point is that what we know from these solar analogs, however, is that during the Hadean to Paleoarchean, and there's really little argument over this, that the solar wind pressure was much greater than it is today. The arguments come in terms of the exact number. 10 to 100 is what most people accept. Could be as high as 1,000 for some time periods. But in general, we're talking about a very different interaction regime than we think about today. And when that comes into play, then we start thinking about questions like this. And of course, the point here is not to go through each one of these reactions, but just to show that there are a whole series of atmospheric escape processes. And for the early Earth, these would all be exacerbated under the conditions of this greatly enhanced solar wind pressure. Again, we summarized this in a paper some time ago. The question then becomes, okay, if we have this incredible pressure, even with the magnetic field, but certainly without the magnetic field, why did Earth retain its water? We would have basically had a significant water loss without a magnetic field. That's a very kind of key fundamental question because, of course, water is fundamental for life, at least as we know it. So the other part of this, of course, as we'll see, I'll make the argument that Earth's magnetic field was here for at least 4.2 billion years. And then we get into the question of comparing histories of planets. And when we think about Mars, we know from the Martian magnetic anomalies that it had a magnetic field, and many people believe that, at least for some periods of time, it had a surface ocean. And of course, the evolution has been very different. Now, the magnetic field and the loss of magnetic field is not the only reason that Mars lost its water, at least its surface water, but it was most likely a contributing factor. So with that motivation, what I'll touch on, without going into great detail and in the first part, is just a few key things about fundamentals and the way that the dynamo works. Then we'll talk about the Hadean to Paleoarchean, and then we'll contrast this really with the Ediacaran and some very new work that has made us think differently about the field during the Ediacaran. And then we'll kind of put this together in a brief look through time. Okay, some fundamentals about paleomagnetic recording. I can't tell you how many times I've been out in the field or been in my office and someone says, well, I have this great sample of magnetite. Magnetite is a common magnetic mineral. It's a key magnetic mineral. And they show me something like this, and they say, well, this would be a great magnetic recorder for you in studying paleomagnetism. And I have to tell them, well, no, that's not actually the way it works. These are actually beautiful magnetite crystals. These are from the Adirondacks. But magnetism is all about something we call fine particle magnetism. So for magnetism and paleomagnetism to work, you, as a general rule of thumb, when I tell my students is you shouldn't be able to see the grains. They shouldn't be visible to the naked eye. And this is something that we call a single domain theory. And that is, if we think about a small magnetic grain, when I say small, a nominal size of this single domain, that's where we have a uniform magnetization, should be about 50 nanometers. They can be larger. I'll get to that in a second. But what happens if the grain starts growing larger? If the grain starts growing larger, it starts producing these things that we call domain walls. And that's actually to conserve energy. So we get a magnetic particle that could still have a net magnetization, but it's much more complex. And what's happening in a domain wall is you can see the magnetization vector is swinging around. Now, for those of us interested in studying the Precambrian, this is just an absolutely fundamental point. And it's a fundamental point because what makes these domain walls move around? Time, but heat. So if most of the rocks we're interested in studying have been heated to various degrees, and these domain walls are going to move around in different ways, and we're going to impart a new magnetization to the sample. So really, if we're interested in tracking the magnetization back in time, we really have to have a way to isolate these tiny magnetic grains. And it's not just purely in an equine grain. We can also get into what we call a single domain field if we have a more elongated grain. Um, and it's really a kind of a Goldilocks field. If the grains get much smaller, if we start talking about, let's say, 10 nanometer grains, then the super paramagnetic. At that point, the thermal energy actually exceeds the stability field at room temperature. So we really need to be in this Goldilocks field. We can we can tolerate things up a little bit into something we call the pseudo single domain field up in here. But if we get up into the multi-domain field, then we start having real problems in the preservation of the magnetization through time. Okay. Enough of the fundamentals of magnetism. Fine particle magnetism is the thing to remember. What drives the dynamo? Things that we're going to return to later in the talk. Well, obviously, convection in the outer core is the key factor when we have the magnetic field lines twisting, and to produce what we call a self-sustaining dynamo. That's the whole trick of the dynamo. It's easy to produce a dynamo for a short period of time, but to actually get it to be self-sustaining is the real challenge. Today, we believe it's actually the growth of the inner core, and we can have latent heat release by the crystallization of iron in onto the outer core, as well as the expulsion of light elements that drives buoyancy, that helps drive this convection and the generation of the Earth's magnetic field. If we don't have an inner core, and we'll talk about the relevance of that later, then we really are just relying on heat release from the core mantle boundary at a sufficient rate to actually drive convection. If it's all by conduction, we won't actually have convection in the core and we won't have a dynamo. The other point I would like to raise here, which is an important point, is that let's consider what changes the efficiency of the dynamo. What changes the dynamo on timescales of, let's say, tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years? Well, we really need to change the boundary conditions and the core mantle boundary heat flux. And one really good way to do this is to drop a slab close to the core mantle boundary. If we do that, then we can potentially change the core mantle boundary, and the pattern of that, we believe, can have an influence on the overall efficiency of the dynamo. And those are going to be important things that we'll return to later. Okay, jumping right into the Hadean to Paleoarchean. The other part that I didn't mention in terms of fundamentals is that nominally magnetite is our primary magnetic recorder. We also look at the titanomagnetite series. Magnetite has a Curie temperature of 580 degrees Celsius. That means that if we're really limited to rocks in the upper green schist facies, if we start getting into amphibolite, that's too close to the Curie temperature or exceeds the Curie temperature of magnetite, and the rocks are not suitable. We've searched around the planet. This doesn't mean that there aren't going to be rocks that discovered that are older than, let's say, the Paleoarchean, that are just of the green schist facies. But most things we have seen are highly deformed and in the amphibolite facies. So there really needs to be a different way of actually approaching this problem. And the way that we have approached it is something that we call single crystal paleointensity, single crystal paleomagnetism or paleointensity measurements. Now, the single crystal method actually was first developed really to not just look at the early Earth, but really to get at this fundamental problem that I talked about earlier of the single domain to multi-domain problem. Most whole rocks are dominated by multi-domain magnetic grains, whereas if we're looking at single crystals, particularly very small single crystals like a zircon, they're going to be in the single domain phase, or maybe the pseudo-single at most. You literally can't fit large multi-domain grains in some of the crystals that we've been looking at. So what is shown on this diagram is field strength versus age, and these are the first measurements of zircons in our laboratory, and we'll get into some of the details on this later. There in the blue and the red symbols, back through time. Some of these other symbols are single crystal measurements, but from some extant rocks. And these data suggested that the Earth's magnetic field was as old as 4.2 billion years. As a kind of nuance, the detection limit here, you can just barely see it, this would be the magnetic field if there still would actually be a very weak magnetic field on Earth seen on the surface if we had no internal dynamo. And that would just be the interaction of the solar wind with the atmosphere. So we're well above this detection limit and indicates that we are actually looking at an ancient dynamo field. I think most people here on this call are familiar with zircons, but I often show this picture in general talks just as a reminder here of what we're talking about, and those from foreign countries or non-US countries, sorry. This is a US dime. So this is the type of thing we're measuring, a zircon. For paleomagnetism, this is an extremely challenging measurement. And it really requires new technology, technological developments. The ultra high sensitivity squid magnetometer in our laboratory, this is still the most sensitive 3-component magnetometer of its time. We use CO2 laser heating. We can also use a squid microscope. This is the microscope from Hirokuni Oda in Geological Survey of Japan, AIST. That's a 1-component measurement. And we've been able to do comparative studies between our measurements and those in Japan. And those are actually shown here, where we've actually measured an oriented zircon and brought it over to Japan, and we get very similar types of measurements. Also, just kind of a flavor of what these things look like in the Jack Hills rocks. This is a zircon, the quartz of the microconglomerate, along with some fuchsite. And these are the measurements that were actually done in Japan, a very clear signal. We also compared this with the surrounding quartz, and you can see there's really virtually no magnetization. So this magnetization is coming from the zircon. It's a very strong, relatively strong signal in this instrument. Now, to have zircons record a magnetization, not all zircons have magnetizations. They have to have magnetic inclusions. There are several sources of these, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later. But one source is actually shown here. This is the work of Richard Bono, where Richard used a device at the Naval Research Lab to actually scan over the surface of a zircon. This is the surface scan. And he noticed here that there was this very clear kind of signal, magnetic signal, nothing seen on the surface, but something seen at depth. So then what Richard did was then take this sample to the focused ion beam. So now this surface here would be equivalent to this surface. So the slice is going to go through here. And what he saw was that, sorry, right underneath there was this kind of melt inclusion with different types of silicates within them, some of which have iron. So we think that this is one of the sources of the paleomagnetic signature within zircons. One of the questions that comes up, because not only are these technically challenging measurements, but the questions are always about the preservation of the remnants. We have tests to indicate that the remnants has not been reset after it was put into the conglomerate around 3 billion years. But what about this history between 3 billion years and let's say 4.2 billion years? Well, one of the methods that we have used is Dustin Trail's lithium diffusion method. And in this method, Dustin realized that if we look at the thickness of the preserved bands, if they are preserved to begin with, of lithium, this could tell us something about the thermal history. So the CL image is here. You see the nice crystal banding. And this is a SIMS band that shows nicely that we have lithium being preserved. And using Dustin's method, this would suggest that this zircon has not seen temperatures higher than 475 degrees Celsius since its crystallization. 475 turns out to be the peak metamorphic temperature of the Jack Hills rocks. So this is strong confirming evidence, again, because the magnetization in this case is actually isolated at much higher temperatures, that we actually can have a preserved ancient magnetization of this age in this zircon. Again, this is a 4.2 billion year example. So we next in a paper in 2020 tested to see if we could replicate the data, and we could. These are now more data points that are actually in here together with some lithium constraints. We did reject a data point based on some lithium measurements. We had questioned this in the original science paper in 2015. So we think that this one has actually potentially been reset, but the other ones have not. And what has come out from this is this idea that the field strength is actually quite robust in the Hadean. And that's important in terms of preserving water, and then became more depressed in the Eoarchean times, and then picked up again in the later Mesoarchean. Well, to test this, we then went to the Barberton Mountain Lands. And this was, of course, after the recognition of the green sandstone bed by Byerly and Don Lowe. And we sampled this with our colleagues, this is Axel Hoffman in the foreground. The green sandstone has lots of zircons in it. So it's a very nice potential recorder for us. We use all non-magnetic methods to actually separate these out. Here's an example of one of the zircons that we separated from the green sandstone collection. This is an orthogonal vector plot of the magnetization. The only point here that I'd like to make, which is a very important point, is that this actually, it doesn't have a single component of magnetization. It has a two-component magnetization. This is the one that we're going to rely on for our paleomagnetic measurements. But this tells us, because we expect, this is Greenschist grade rock, it should have some other magnetization. And this has been studied in other samples by our group and others and tested. So this component has been shown to be a primary magnetization from and within this temperature range. If we look at the magnetization versus demagnetization temperature, again, it decreases around 590, a very clear signature of magnetite. And we're going to use 565 as a good estimate of the temperature to estimate paleointensity to compare with our estimates from the Jack Hills. These are some measurements, and again, I think useful for some people in terms of the technique that we used. Up to this point, we would have done all our samples, measured all our samples using non-magnetic techniques, and then applied magnetic measurements, CO2 laser heating, and field off, field on steps to these whole zircons. We haven't looked inside the zircons yet. We go through a series of selection criteria before that in terms of the magnetization, and then further, when we actually start this analysis, together with Bill Davis and the Geological Survey of Canada, where we first start to look inside the zircons. And we're looking for zircons that are relatively pristine like these. And now we're going to start to poke around with them using the shrimp to look at their ages and look for any evidence of resetting. In this case, we have clear evidence of zircons that are Eoarchean age. Again, we're kind of poking around here at various places. But at least so far in our collection, there are Hadean zircons here, but every Hadean zircon that we have seen, there is a Hadean core shown here in the red, but there's also an Eoarchean rim. So the oldest magnetization that we would assign, at least to our collection so far, is Eoarchean in age. I've mentioned all about these selection criteria. The selection criteria resulted in selecting only about 2% of the zircons from the Jack Hills. The Barberton's a little better, but it's still a lot of work to get this 3.5% of the data that I'm about to show. So this is the record that I discussed previously from the Jack Hills, and we want to now compare this with the new data from Barberton. And we can see that it actually falls right on top. This is magnetic field strength versus time, which is fascinating to us. As someone who's interested in the dynamo, it's fascinating in particular because this sort of depressed field behavior was seen not just in the Jack Hills, but now also in the Barberton area. And although we typically use the magnetic inclination because it's has a higher fidelity for tracking plate motion, there's also a relationship between magnetic field strength and just latitude. So the lack of actually variation here is also an implication of latitudinal stasis, as well as a lack of things that are changing the efficiency of the dynamo, the core mantle boundary that might be associated with plate tectonics. So we asked ourselves the question, and this is some modeling work that was done by Richard Bono, to look at what plate tectonics might be like over the last 600 million years. So Richard sampled the continents, and they used the G plates reconstructions to tabulate what all these points would, what their latitudinal motion would be like over the 600 million year record that is sort of the most robust. So an example of this would be we might have a point that starts here, and we kind of backtrack this versus time. And the point that he's really tabulating here is the maximum latitudinal value. And what we can see here is that it's about 75 degrees, and that turns out to be about the mode of the population, that about on average, most plates over 600 million years, most points on these plates have seen about 75 degrees of motion. That's actually quite a lot. So what would be compatible with the data that I showed previously in terms of having sites in the Yilgarn and the Barberton area that aren't seeing this type of motion, and there just aren't these types of representations in the plates of the last 600 million years. And this is giving us our first indication that maybe something is really different. We can also express this in terms of probability, because we have data that's actually constraining both the relative latitudinal distance between these sites, as well as the maximum latitude motion, which is this type of analysis. And the probabilities are not zero, but the probabilities are very, very low, and this formulation less than 1%. So this is, again, is really indicating to us that there is really something very different going on during this time interval. And it's to first order, we would say it's more compatible with some form of stagnant lid tectonics. I'm using this in a very general sense. I'm just saying that it's really, to me, not like plate tectonic motion that we see. I'm looking at this in a kinematic way. And maybe that the early continental crust is forming without plate tectonics. And there are many people have talked about this. There are ways to do this. These are some modeling results from Hans-Peter Bunge and the Munich group that we're working with on. And, we could basically have crustal generation that would occur without these types of events. So to kind of conclude the first part, in time, we would say that the simultaneous magnetic recording by zircons of magnetic records having very different Phanerozoic histories supports the primary record of the dynamo at 4.2 billion years. And it really suggests magnetic shielding was in place very early on, and that's really important for protecting the hydrosphere. To us, the mobility test kind of fails for this time interval, and really is consistent more with models of a stagnant lid. A point that I won't talk about, I'm happy to take questions on this, but we can actually, since we do have data from the Barberton area, we can tie our records to data where we have full paleolatitude records from extant rocks. And this would suggest that these sites were at low latitudes throughout the Eoarchean. And this is important, I think, for some ideas on the evolution of life, having these sort of stable sites at low latitudes. And the greater hypothesis, of course, is that we don't really need plate tectonics. We can have types of geochemical cycling in a stagnant lid regime for the evolution of life, at least on our terrestrial planet. Okay, jumping to the Ediacaran, and why have we become so interested in this time interval? Well, it's not just us. There has sort of been a revolution in the last 15 years in terms of studies of Earth and Earth's thermal evolution that have caused many people to rethink about the age of the inner core. This has arguably started with changes in ideas on Earth's, the thermal conductivity of iron in core conditions, but also just the general idea of how we can think about the thermal evolution of Earth without having an entirely molten early Earth, and that might extend as young as the Paleoarchean and be inconsistent with the rock record. These are some results from Peter Driscoll, picking one model in particular that was done completely independent of our group. And this is dipole moment versus age. Age is now going from left to right. And what Peter predicted from these models is the dipole moment would decrease with time and would get to some critical value, something called a weak field state, where the field would almost completely collapse and then increase again when we had inner core growth. Independent of Peter's work, our group was conducting a series of studies in the Ediacaran, and particularly I'll highlight first the work of Richard Bono in this blue symbol here, using the single crystal paleointensity technique, and this time on feldspars from the Set-Eels complex. And Richard attained this value of the field strength, which was 10 times weaker than the present day field. Now that's really an extraordinary value, because the rocks of the Set-Eels, and they cooled over at least tens of millions of years. So we're looking at the time average field, not just an individual reversal. So that was actually a profoundly interesting result. Within a few years, there were a whole series of other results, and I'll show those more clearly in another diagram later, that both confirmed this event, this very low field value. Sherbakova and the Baroque lab from Russia, and a series of researchers in the Liverpool lab, including Fauna, who published several papers on the subject. So part of the models, not just of the model that I showed from Peter Driscoll, but also models from Stefan Lambros from Lyon and Francis Nemo, had suggested that prior to inner core growth, we would have a decreasing core mantle boundary heat flux, and as the entire system is cooling. And with this, we would have a kind of a weakening dynamo. So now remember, before getting back to the fundamentals, before we have inner core growth, the only way to actually power the dynamo is heat release at the core mantle boundary. And that is going to become, over billions of years, kind of less efficient, and to the point that the field might actually decay. Now, what Richard in this paper in 2019 did was compile results. Now, the symbols that are actually colored are single crystal results. The other symbols are select data that might average the field, and larger symbols. The smaller symbols don't average the field. And we can see that there's probably quite a lot of variation. This variation could be due to changes in the core mantle boundary, things that I talked about in terms of changes in the core mantle boundary due, let's say, the configuration of slabs through time. But behind this, there's also this hint that the field is actually gradually weakening through time until this point we get into the Ediacaran. Now, the second key observation and prediction of inner core growth is after this time of that the field almost completely collapsed, the field should jump up in intensity. And the reason it should jump up in intensity, as soon as we start to form the inner core, we have new energy sources. So we have new sources to power the dynamo again, and that should jump up. And Tinghong Zhu studied rocks anorthosites from Oklahoma and saw this. In fact, 532 million years, there was this increase in intensity. So this seems to be the other signal of inner core growth. And this is a model showing this, where we'd have decreasing from Francis Nemo, decreasing heat flux, and then we would have sort of the start of inner core growth here. Now, the data set is still sparse. And one thing that we wanted to do, and this is the work of a postdoc in our group, Wen Tao Wang, who chose two intervals, basically said, well, okay, we don't exactly know, and it's going to take a long time to really get enough data set in here to show how this happened. But to first order, we're predicting the fact that the field here should be very, very different from the field here. So what Wen Tao did is he took samples that were, to us, magnetically nearly identical. What we're looking at is a feldspar here, and this is from the Bushveld complex, where, and the details here, this is magnetic hysteresis, and for those of you who are not in magnetism, what's important about this? Well, this is a type of a signature that you won't see from many whole rock samples, if any whole rock samples in the paleointensity database. This is a single domain magnetic signature, and that is confirmed by doing SEM analyses, and we see that there are magnetic needles within this. In this case, these are exotic magnetic particles. Again, the magnetization is going to be flowing within this axis, and it's going to be in the single domain state. And Wenzel then compared this with some gabbros from Brazil. And again, the first order, you look at these diagrams and they're pretty similar. Certainly single domain. They both have kind of needles in them. When we do the paleointensity experiment, and the paleointensity experiment is shown in here, the details are it's a series of paired tests. And just to explain this for people who might be interested, in a paleointensity experiment, what you do is a series of paired steps. In one step, you remove the natural remnant magnetization. So we're demagnetizing the sample. And then we're going to heat it over that same temperature range in the presence of an applied field. So now we have the magnetization that we have lost on the vertical axis and a magnetization that's gained. Okay, and since we do this in the presence of a field that we know, we can solve for the ancient magnetic field. In practice, so that generates each one of these circles. In practice, we do this over a whole series of steps to get a more robust estimate. And that line actually tells us the field intensity value. Not only that, we do a series of back checks. We want to make sure that we can go back to this step and within acceptable errors to see whether or not we have actually had any alteration. And there's no sign of alteration here. They're not perfect matches in all cases, but there can be subtle differences in how the grains are actually picking up the magnetization. The end point here is that we're getting a field around 60 to 70 microteslas. Now, what does that mean? That's an Earth-like field. That would be a field that we might see at the poles today. So really nothing unusual about that. Let's get to our Ediacaran example, 591 in this case. Again, we have the straight line here, and we have even better replication of the points. The ancient field value is 2 microteslas. There is no place on Earth in a natural environment today that we have a field of 2 microteslas. 2 microteslas is the field that was measured by the InSight lander on Mars, a planet without an active magnetic field. So this is a profoundly low value. It's 30 times lower than the Earth's magnetic field today. It's actually the lowest time average field that we know about. So these are the values that Wen Tao recovered. So it passed into first order of the test. Again, we don't know the exact line. This is just a line fit, but there's certainly going to be details that worked out here. But somehow we have to get from these higher field values to a field that completely collapses. And again, the new value is 30 times weaker than the present Earth's magnetic field. There are different ideas, and there are still debates about the age of intercore growth. Our model, basically, and our interpretation is has certain benefits. It's arguably, it is the only data that's actually represented by single domain, purely single domain results. It's a database based of the value. We actually,
Jerk off if someone make it.
okay, we now have data that are from several cratons, and we have model results also. So we believe that this is the time of inner core growth. However, I just want to say that further on in the talk, everything the furthering interpretations are actually independent of the inner core growth interpretation. It's really just looking at the field value itself. So now we're going to take a closer look at the field strength versus age here. And what we can see here is that these are the single crystal data. There's another data point that I haven't talked about here. And some of the data from other labs, some of these are not thermal data, and some of them could have multi-domain effects. But the first order, they are actually tracing the same type of pattern that we have looked at before. Now, the ultra-low field value is around 26 million years. We don't know what the field evolution here is, but we're actively trying to track that down. But I think now immediately the sharpness of this curve, for those of you who are interested in this time interval, starts to become very interesting, and very interesting to us, because there is now this much sharper correlation with the evolution of the crown group and the stem groups, and the bilaterians and the non-bilaterian groups. So I won't talk about the SRAM event. The SRAM event is also down in here. We can talk about that later. I'm mainly going to talk about these types of correlation for what it is. I will say that I've been a bit of a skeptic about these types of correlations, and I've been drawn to this mainly by the sharpness and the new data that we've actually produced. But let's just talk a little bit about this. There are other data sets for different time intervals that have talked, and papers that have talked about the relationships of the low fields and evolution. I would like to point out that it really depends on the boundary conditions. The linkages that we might see today are not necessarily relevant for the Precambrian, vice versa. And it depends where life is in its kind of evolutionary stage. When we think about these types of linkages, what most people naturally gravitate to is this idea that there is going to be a greater solar energetic flux. This is from the solar wind, and greater UV radiation. And those are true, but we'll get to that in a second. But then further is this idea that these effects will damage DNA, and that this could cause either mutations, or it could cause extinctions, depending on your interpretation on this. And this is the line of evidence that Joe Mert had followed, particularly when his correlations were with the Cambrian. And he believed that the intensity was lower in the Cambrian from a higher reversal rate. There were no paleointensity data available when he wrote that paper. And now what we've shown, this is really an Ediacaran low intensity event, whereas the intensity starts to increase significantly in the earliest Cambrian. It turns out that this is a very long argument. Carl Sagan actually criticized the linkage, interestingly enough, of the solar energetic particles and UV radiation, because he argued that there's a significant shielding from the atmosphere and the oceans. So if we're thinking about evolution of life, all we need to be thinking about is evolution underneath a meter of water or so, and that's going to shield many of these events. So I would like to say that I'm not discounting some effect of these, but to us, we need another mechanism for these, if there is a linkage between the magnetic field and these evolutionary events. The other thing that really kind of struck me and was kind of driven home working with people like Shuhai Zhao at Virginia Tech was, what is the other characteristic of life, sort of right in this interval here? Well, life gets large. The Ediacaran fauna were evolving certainly well before here. But the big evolutionary breakthrough here is that we start seeing large forms that are mobile. And for biologists, no one would really challenge the idea that this is a hint of a greater oxygen demand. So then the question becomes, and now started getting into a very contentious field, what is the oxygen history? There certainly are some indicators, and I've chosen one, the selenium isotopes, that would suggest that there is actually an increase in oxygenation exactly during this time interval. That would be compatible with maybe crossing a threshold to allow these large mobile animals to evolve. Again, this does not mean that life is not evolving prior to that. It's just that we seem to have a step function here in the larger mobile animal forms. So how could this possibly be related, however, to the Earth's magnetic field? This gets back to the fundamentals that we were talking about before in terms of the motivation here. The way that we have proposed that this might be related to is in changing this relationship in how we have the magnetic field interacting with the solar wind. We talked about the standoff distance, or I mentioned it being defined here. How far the Earth is actually protected from the solar wind and the Earth's atmosphere. This diagram is hopelessly not to scale. Today, the standoff distance is about 10 Earth radii. We can now make calculations based on this, based on our magnetic field values. And we know that field values are tremendously less than this. It would be less than 4 or 4.2 Earth radii, sort of as typical, but during a coronal mass ejection, it could be less than 2 Earth radii. These are just numbers, kind of hard for people who don't think about these things every day to get a good feeling for these types of things. But fortunately, nature provided us a spectacle in May. I think many of you may have experienced this, where we had coronal mass ejections that were hurled toward Earth. And we have this kind of phenomena of low latitude auroral occurrences as the ionosphere gets charged up from the interaction of the enhanced solar wind. You saw these, the magnetosphere would be compressed to less than 5 Earth radii for maybe hours. The phenomena of aurora can actually be longer, but that would be sort of like every minute, every day during the Ediacaran. So it's a very different type of system and an extreme forcing of the Earth system. Now, this takes us to a classic work by Cisco and Chen in 75. And what they said, pointed out is within the magnetosphere, we have an area, something called the plasma pause. The plasma pause basically bounds the value where we have the outer part of the atmosphere that is dominated by hydrogen. At these standoff values, and these are the magnetic field values and standoff being on the y-axis, we would go from the present day down to something here, and we start getting close to intersecting the plasma pause, and certainly during coronal mass ejection, we would be emptying the plasma pause. That means that all hydrogen that's in the system escapes. Once hydrogen escapes from the plasma pause, it escapes from the Earth's system, it's gone. It's never coming back, and it's something that is lost from the Earth's. And that's sort of a variation of this. In a general sense, we believe that the magnetosphere is going to become, not just through this mechanism, but from other mechanisms, is going to be less efficient at trapping hydrogen in the system. If we trap hydrogen, we lose it to space. we will, over time, have a net increase in oxygenation of the atmosphere and of the oceans. The challenge at this point is really trying to figure out how much. There are some models like this, and again, pardon the complicated axes in this paper by Gunnell. Magnetic field intensity is here, Earth is there, decreasing intensity is this way, loss is on the vertical axis. So hydrogen loss is increasing as we get to lower dipole moment, but it's in this model, it's relatively modest. It would only be about 30%. There are other models where we would start to get to a few percent. So there's variation in the models. But again, the idea that we might have actually crossed an oxygenation threshold has been our interpretation, and that might have been significant enough to actually cause this change in the size of the animals of the Ediacaran. So to summarize this part, the geomagnetic field almost completely collapsed in Ediacaran. Some new work that we haven't published yet, but we have talked about and will be coming out, suggests that maybe the field actually did completely collapse. We're intensely working on this because if the field really did collapse, this is another mechanism where we could have enhanced hydrogen being pulsed out of the system during shorter time intervals. Our interpretation is that this is a sign of core nucleation, and we have evidence for this not just from the ultra-low field values, but also the magnetizations leading into it and then coming out of it. We have field values that define the fact that the standoff distance was very different than the Earth today, and these would have been kind of constant values, this extreme forcing. And the hypothesis is that the hydrogen loss was really what led to the oxygenation, allowing animal evolution. It's a hypothesis. So just to briefly review some of the topics that I've talked about today, I think it's kind of an interesting comparison. We think that the Hadean magnetic field, the early establishment of the field, was important potentially for protecting the earliest life. It may not be coincidental that the Earth's magnetic field was present during what are now the estimates for the last universal common ancestor at 4.2 billion years. These are obviously genetic estimates. As we move through time, we went into this period after the strong magnetic field where we had a depressed variation, which again, we interpret as being the first kinematic evidence for some form of stagnant lid. We had a transition to plate tectonics. We would actually, in work that we're developing, think that full plate tectonics didn't occur to much later into the Archean. And then during this very long time interval, we have to rely just on a thermally driven dynamo. It's not until the very close of the Precambrian that the dynamo is almost completely collapsing, and then we have the onset of inner core growth that results in this increase in intensity. But of course, then, as I just talked about, we think that this very inefficient trapping of the magnetosphere may have allowed hydrogen to be released. So in conclusion, I think it's a nice comparison of how the magnetic field, in this one case, the strong magnetic field may have been very important for life on Earth, whereas in the Ediacaran, the weak magnetic field may have actually been the parameter, but weak for just a limited time interval. I would like to point out here that there's a large group of colleagues that have kind of made this work possible, a large group of students. I think we have people from 10 different countries represented, a huge amount of field work, modeling, as well as laboratory work. And I'd like to thank all of them and apologize if I missed anyone's names. And thank you again for the opportunity to kind of share some of the things that we've been thinking about and working on. I'd be happy to join in any discussion.
All right. Thank you, John, for a great talk.